being able to defeat it, but that doesn't mean there aren't concerns. And so that's why, as I said last hour, Hallie, it's important to talk about a potential funding request coming from the administration. We're hearing that the White House plans to ask Congress for more money to fund their operations in Iran. The longer that it takes, the more I think Republicans even will start to lose their patience when it comes to boots on the ground, potentially something the administration, how Congress is trying to respond to this effort. It's not the end of the road there. Of course, though, as these operations go on, we're seeing Congress become more and more irrelevant and sort of ceding that power to the executive branch, which is exactly why Democrats are pushing those votes to begin with, Hallie.
And just to be clear, Jules, as you make the point here, not signs of much daylight between the majority of the Republican conference here and President Trump.
The Senate chamber witnessed a significant moment of institutional resistance when lawmakers confronted the administration's military authority regarding Iran. A war powers resolution aimed at limiting presidential military action failed to pass, yet the vote revealed deepening fissures within the Republican coalition that had previously maintained disciplined support for the White House agenda. Senator Rand Paul of Kentucky stood as the sole Republican consistently voting to constrain executive war powers, demonstrating that principled opposition to unchecked military authority still exists within the GOP, even as the majority of his colleagues maintain their alignment with the administration's position on Iran operations. The procedural maneuvering around the Iran vote exposed the tactical limitations facing congressional Democrats attempting to assert legislative authority over military engagements. Despite filing multiple privileged resolutions that could force expedited votes bypassing the typical 60-vote threshold, Democrats found themselves unable to overcome Republican unity on the final count. Senators Tim Kaine, Cory Booker, Chris Murphy, and others have signaled their intention to continue forcing repeated votes on war powers measures, employing a strategy of persistent legislative pressure designed to gradually erode GOP support as the conflict's costs and casualties mount. The human toll of the Iran conflict has become increasingly difficult for lawmakers to ignore, with 13 American troops killed and billions of dollars expended on military operations that have also contributed to rising domestic gasoline prices. These tangible consequences have transformed what might otherwise remain an abstract constitutional debate into a matter of constituent concern, potentially shifting the political calculus for Republicans representing states where military families and economic pressures create conflicting pressures.
In just the last hour, we've been looking at this vote in which lawmakers in the Senate were trying to pass a bill that would require the president to get the green light from Congress before more strikes against Iran. That bill has now failed, and that vote is closed. That's a done deal. Julie Sturkin is on the Hill. Walk us through what happened.
Yeah, Hallie, as we talked about last hour, this was pretty pre-baked. I say that because we knew that only one Democrat, Senator John Fetterman, was prepared to vote with Republicans against the war powers resolution, and only one Republican, Senator Rand Paul, voted with Democrats for it. Now, what this war powers resolution does, as we talked about, is essentially if it passed, and if it passed in the House, and if there was a veto-proof majority, it would restrain the president's future military action in Iran. But that is not going anywhere. There's a House vote expected tomorrow. Speaker Johnson told me this morning that he feels pretty good about it.
The administration's argument that the operations are necessary to degrade Iranian military capabilities and support Israel has thus far proven sufficient to maintain party discipline. But the sustainability of this position remains questionable as the conflict extends. The State of the Union address provided a dramatic backdrop for congressional dissent, with Democratic lawmakers executing a multi-pronged strategy of resistance that ranged from total boycott to strategic walkouts to vocal confrontation within the chamber itself. Approximately 50 Democratic lawmakers chose to skip the address entirely, attending instead a People's State of the Union rally on the National Mall, organized by progressive groups Move On and Meet Us Touch. This alternative gathering featured federal workers, immigrants, and others directly affected by administration policies, creating a counter-narrative to the presidential address. The visual symbolism of resistance during the speech conveyed powerful messaging despite leadership attempts to maintain decorum. House Minority Leader Hakeem Jeffries had privately urged members to practice silent defiance or abstain from attendance entirely, warning against unforced errors that might alienate moderate voters. Yet the disciplined restraint collapsed at various moments during the nearly two-hour address, which became the longest State of the Union speech since records began in 1964. Representative Al Green of Texas was escorted from the chamber after holding a sign reading, "Black people aren't apes," referencing a controversial social media video posted by the president depicting former President Barack Obama and First Lady Michelle Obama As apes, the confrontation over immigration policy produced some of the most heated exchanges of the evening, with Representatives Ilhan Omar and Rashida Tlaib shouting, "You killed Americans," as the president criticized Democrats for blocking Department of Homeland Security funding. Their outcry referenced the shooting deaths of two U.S. citizens, Renee Good and Alex Preddy, by federal immigration agents in Minneapolis the previous month. Representative Norma Torres silently held up photographs of the deceased during the speech, a gesture that transformed personal tragedy into political statement without violating chamber rules against verbal disruption. The administration's response to these protests revealed a calculated approach to political theater, with the president repeatedly calling out seated Democrats for failing to applaud, attempting to create viral moments that would portray opposition lawmakers as unpatriotic or obstructionist. When Democrats refused to stand for the assertion that government's first duty is protecting citizens rather than illegal aliens, Trump castigated them before a cheering Republican audience, converting what had begun as a traditional address into confrontational spectacle. This tactic of baiting opposition representatives into visible dissent served the administration's narrative of victimization and resistance against entrenched opposition. The boycott strategy represented a significant evolution in Democratic tactical thinking following the previous year's disruptions, which some party members acknowledged had proven ineffective or counterproductive. By removing themselves from the chamber entirely, absent lawmakers denied the administration the visual of bipartisan attendance that normally legitimizes these addresses, while avoiding the risk of appearing unhinged or disrespectful through visible protest. The counter-programming approach allowed Democrats to control their own messaging environment, speaking to audiences predisposed to agree with their critique rather than performing for a national television audience that might interpret disruption negatively. The Justice Department's investigation into Federal Reserve Chairman Jerome Powell has emerged as perhaps the most significant flashpoint in the deteriorating relationship between the executive branch and congressional Republicans. Multiple GOP senators have publicly broken with the administration over what they characterize as an attempt to undermine Federal Reserve independence through politically motivated criminal investigation. Senator Tom Tillis of North Carolina, a member of the Senate Banking Committee, announced he would oppose confirmation of any Federal Reserve nominee until the investigation is resolved, a stance that could effectively stall administration appointments given the committee's 13-11 partisan breakdown. Senator Lisa Murkowski of Alaska has been particularly forceful in her condemnation, stating after speaking directly with Powell that the investigation represents nothing more than an attempt at coercion by the administration. Her suggestion that Congress should investigate the Justice Department rather than the Fed chair represents a remarkable inversion of oversight expectations, with the legislative branch positioning itself as defender of institutional independence against executive overreach. Murkowski's warning that market stability and broader economic health depend upon Federal Reserve independence echoes concerns expressed by financial markets and international observers watching American institutional norms erode. The specific allegations underlying the investigation concern testimony Powell gave regarding cost overruns in the Federal Reserve headquarters renovation project, with a perjury referral initiated by Representative Anna Paulina Luna, citing contradictions between Powell's statements and plans submitted to federal review agencies. However, Republican lawmakers have largely dismissed these allegations as pretextual, with Senator John Kennedy of Louisiana stating he would be stunned and shocked if Powell had done anything wrong and warning that conflict between the executive branch and Federal Reserve would cause interest rates to rise rather than fall. Senator Kevin Cramer of North Dakota, while criticizing Powell's performance as Fed chair, explicitly stated he does not believe the chairman is a criminal. The breadth of Republican opposition to the Powell investigation extends across the ideological spectrum of the party, from moderates like Susan Collins of Maine to conservatives like French Hill of Arkansas, who served with Powell at Treasury during the George H.W. Bush administration. House Financial Services Committee Chair Hill defended Powell as a person of the highest integrity and warned that pursuing criminal charges over renovation testimony creates an unnecessary distraction that could undermine monetary policy decision-making for this and future administrations. This institutionalist perspective prioritizes long-term systemic stability over short-term partisan advantage, representing a significant cleavage within the Republican coalition. The silence of Senate Banking Committee Chair Tim Scott regarding the Powell investigation has proven conspicuous as his Republican colleagues have rushed to defend the Fed chairman. Scott, who previously ran unsuccessfully for the Republican presidential nomination against Trump and was considered for the vice presidential nomination, has generally avoided weighing in on Federal Reserve independence questions throughout the administration. His current focus on advancing cryptocurrency legislation backed by the administration may explain his reticence, but his failure to join the chorus of GOP defenders has raised questions about whether his presidential ambitions or loyalty to the White House are constraining his institutional responsibilities as committee chair. The economic implications of the administration's conflict with the Federal Reserve extend beyond immediate market volatility to fundamental questions about monetary policy credibility. The Federal Reserve's independence has long been considered essential to maintaining investor confidence and controlling inflation expectations, with political interference historically correlating with adverse economic outcomes in other nations. Senator Kennedy's colorful observation that designing a system to raise interest rates would involve creating conflict between the executive branch and Federal Reserve captures the practical consequences of the administration's approach, even as the president continues demanding rate cuts that Powell has resisted. The convergence of these various confrontations suggests a potential inflection point in the relationship between the Trump administration and congressional Republicans. The war powers votes, while unsuccessful, have demonstrated that at least some GOP senators are willing to break with the White House on matters of constitutional principle and institutional prerogative. The Federal Reserve investigation has generated broader and more forceful Republican opposition than previous administration actions, possibly indicating that attacks on independent institutions generate more unified resistance than policy disagreements or even military interventions. The political calculus for Republican lawmakers has grown increasingly complex as they navigate between base loyalty and institutional preservation. With midterm elections approaching in November, incumbents must weigh the risks of alienating Trump's supporters against the dangers of appearing complicit in executive overreach that might alarm independent voters and institutional conservatives. The anonymous Republican lawmaker quoted expressing frustration that leadership keeps doubling down on stupid suggests that private concern exceeds public dissent, yet the accumulation of public breaks with the administration indicates growing willingness to accept the electoral risks of independence. The administration's response to congressional resistance has followed a familiar pattern of escalation and confrontation rather than accommodation. Rather than moderating rhetoric or adjusting policies to accommodate Republican concerns, the White House has generally doubled down on its positions, attacking critics as disloyal or obstructionist, while maintaining that its actions represent necessary disruption of entrenched interests. This approach has proven effective at maintaining base enthusiasm, but has shown diminishing returns in preserving the unified government control that characterized the early months of the administration. The media coverage of these confrontations has amplified their significance beyond the immediate policy stakes, with visual images of walkouts, protests, and public dissent creating narratives of administration embattlement that can become self-fulfilling prophecies. When Senator Mark Warner walked out of the State of the Union address stating he couldn't sit through it, or when dozens of lawmakers gathered on the National Mall rather than in the House chamber, these images conveyed institutional dysfunction more powerfully than procedural votes or press releases could achieve. The administration's attempts to control the narrative through social media and friendly outlets have proven insufficient to counter mainstream media amplification of dissent. The constitutional implications of these conflicts extend beyond immediate policy outcomes to fundamental questions about the separation of powers and the health of American democratic institutions. The war powers confrontation tests whether Congress can still assert meaningful control over military engagements in an era of executive dominance, while the Federal Reserve investigation raises concerns about whether independent agencies can maintain their autonomy when subjected to criminal investigation by politically motivated prosecutors. The willingness of Republican legislators to challenge their own party's administration on these institutional questions suggests that constitutional norms retain some bipartisan support even in an era of intense polarization. The international implications of these domestic confrontations have not gone unnoticed by allies and adversaries watching American political stability from abroad. The Federal Reserve's credibility affects global financial markets and the dollar's reserve currency status, making attacks on its independence a matter of international concern beyond domestic politics. Similarly, the appearance of congressional acquiescence to unilateral military action shapes perceptions of American reliability and commitment to international law, potentially affecting alliance relationships and diplomatic negotiations. The role of progressive activism in shaping democratic legislative strategy has proven significant in these confrontations, with organizations like Move On and Meet Us Touch providing infrastructure for alternative political expression outside traditional institutional channels. The People's State of the Union rally and similar counter-programming events demonstrate how grassroots mobilization can complement and sometimes drive legislative tactics, creating pressure on lawmakers to adopt more confrontational postures than they might otherwise prefer. This dynamic reflects broader changes in how political opposition is organized and expressed in an era of weakened party structures and strengthened activist networks. The administration's use of social media to bypass traditional communication channels has created new challenges for congressional oversight and response, with presidential statements on platforms like Truth Social often setting policy or making threats without formal administrative process. The civilization threat regarding Iran, posted on social media rather than delivered through diplomatic or military channels, exemplifies this approach and has generated particular concern among lawmakers accustomed to more structured decision-making processes. The difficulty of responding to informal presidential communications that nonetheless carry the weight of policy has complicated congressional efforts to assert meaningful oversight. The economic nationalism that has characterized the administration's trade and tariff policies has created additional tensions with Republican legislators representing agricultural and manufacturing states adversely affected by retaliatory measures. While these policy disagreements have not generated the same level of public confrontation as the war powers or Federal Reserve issues, they contribute to an underlying current of dissatisfaction within the GOP coalition that could surface more visibly as economic impacts intensify. The president's claims of tariff revenue generating hundreds of billions in unanticipated revenue have been met with skepticism by economists and some Republican lawmakers concerned about inflationary effects. The personnel decisions underlying these policy confrontations have received less attention than the public disputes, but may prove equally significant in shaping institutional relationships. The appointment of administration officials with limited government experience or apparent loyalty primarily to the president rather than to institutional norms has accelerated the erosion of traditional checks and balances. Congressional Republicans who previously worked with experienced bureaucrats and respected institutionalists now find themselves dealing with appointees who appear dismissive of legislative prerogatives and constitutional constraints, creating friction that extends beyond specific policy disagreements. The legal frameworks governing these confrontations remain unsettled, with questions about the enforceability of war powers resolutions and the limits of executive privilege in criminal investigations likely to require judicial resolution. The administration's apparent willingness to test these boundaries suggests a strategy of expanding executive authority through fait accompli rather than statutory change, forcing Congress and the courts to react to presidential initiatives rather than proactively constraining them. This approach has proven effective in the short term, but may generate longer-term legal and political costs as institutional resistance coalesces. The psychological dynamics of presidential-congressional relations in this administration differ significantly from previous periods of divided or unified government, with personal loyalty to the president often appearing to override policy substance or institutional interest. The public criticism of Republican legislators who break with the administration, often delivered through social media with personalized attacks, has created an atmosphere of fear that suppresses dissent even when lawmakers privately disagree with White House actions. The willingness of senators like Tillis and Murkowski to accept these risks indicates that some institutional concerns have become sufficiently urgent to outweigh personal political calculations. The historical context of these confrontations suggests parallels with previous periods of executive-legislative conflict, including the Nixon administration's struggles with Congress and the Reagan administration's Iran-Contra affair. Though the current situation differs in important respects, including the speed of information dissemination and the changed media environment, the ability of opposition lawmakers to coordinate resistance through social media and alternative platforms has accelerated the pace of institutional response, while also potentially fragmenting opposition into competing factions with different tactical preferences. The balance between these centrifugal and centripetal forces will shape whether congressional resistance coalesces into effective constraint or dissipates into symbolic protest. The role of the vice president and cabinet in these institutional conflicts has remained notably limited, with Vice President J.D. Vance and senior administration officials generally supporting presidential positions rather than mediating between the executive and legislative branches. This contrasts with historical examples where vice presidents or cabinet members have served as channels of communication and compromise between warring branches, suggesting either that the current administration prefers direct confrontation to negotiation or that potential mediators have been effectively sidelined. The absence of internal administration dissent on public display has reinforced the perception of unified executive determination that makes congressional opposition appear more isolated. The future trajectory of these confrontations remains uncertain, with multiple potential outcomes ranging from gradual accommodation to constitutional crisis depending on how administration and congressional strategies evolve. The accumulation of Republican breaks with the White House suggests that the unified support that characterized the early administration has eroded significantly, yet the remaining majority of GOP legislators continues to provide sufficient support to sustain most administration initiatives. Whether the trend toward independence accelerates or reverses will depend partly on electoral calculations as November approaches, and partly on whether the administration moderates its confrontational approach or escalates further. The fundamental question underlying these specific disputes concerns the nature of presidential power in the American constitutional system and whether the constraints that have historically limited executive authority retain sufficient force to prevent the concentration of unchecked power in the White House. The war powers, Federal Reserve independence, and congressional oversight conflicts all represent different facets of this larger question, testing whether institutional norms and partisan interests can combine to maintain balance between the branches. The outcome of these tests will shape not only the remainder of this administration, but the precedents and expectations that govern future presidencies, making the current confrontations historically significant beyond their immediate policy stakes.